bustling and animate societies of the world today are ironically and often compared to and illustrated through zombie movies. As though eating, breathing, and conceding our way through daily tasks and routines are carried out by lifeless bodily structures, animated flesh lacking consciousness, exhibiting a zombie state. The exterior appears alive, yet is dead inside, empty and insatiable. Is it merely a coincidence that we have been entertained by a string of zombie flicks and series for the past several years? Or could it all be part of a type of zeitgeist, a dark ethos with built-in principles that projects a certain human nature onto the world, an indirect message of the state of humanity, possibly a type of pathogen, a transmitted disease of the self, one's spirit or soul, causing an epidemic within humankind, a zombie apocalypse? But what if this state of being, or lack thereof, is something much more specific? Something that doesn't just eat away at the flesh, mutating one's appearance, but eats away at one's soul, not merely disconnecting them from life, but from God. Modern society may not exactly be suffering from a literal zombie apocalypse, but it is suffering from something analogous, something closer to a zombie state than its definitions may readily offer. This is the narcissist apocalypse. Narcissism is plaguing culture and mass society in a way like never before. Similar to the zombie, it exists, feeds, and destroys aimlessly, for no logical reason outside of an instinctual driving force that seeks to gratify itself and itself only. It has become more than a trend or behavioral extreme. It is now a general fashion statement, a philosophy to life and living. Theorists today define it as a type of socially adaptive strategy formed in response to cultural norms or abuse. Moreover, narcissism has become a cultural pathology, the routine of a fake life, promoting a false self, a plastic and artificial world of redundant superficiality. Indeed, it can be found, recognized, and demonstrated in many facets of our society today. But for this specific installment, we will be focusing on a distinct subgroup, a diseased set of specimens infected by a deadly culture-borne pathogen of self-aggrandizement. Here we will assess, observe, and exemplify this current phenomenon. And let us delve into the process of the contemporary thought is narcissism, male thought or female thought. The narcissistic disposition remains a constant. First, let us properly define the narcissistic personality. Narcissism is generally described by a specific set of enduring and habitual behaviors, starting with a pervasive pattern of grandiosity and fantasy or behavior, pathological dishonesty and embellishment, a need for admiration, and a lack of empathy or regard for others. The grandiosity is demonstrated by an exaggerated and inflated sense of self-importance, believes that he or she is special and unique and can only be understood by or should associate with other special or high-status people. High status is usually defined by attractiveness, power, some coveted subjective quality, or wealth. They have a sense of entitlement or superiority and require excessive admiration and attention from others to regulate a fluctuating sense of self-worth. They are often, though it is usually concealed, deeply envious of others, ultimately dissatisfied with themselves, and believe that others are envious of them. And lastly, the narcissistic personality type is extremely shallow and lacks any true depth. This type shows an air of arrogance and superficiality, with haughty behaviors and attitudes. It should be no surprise to the viewer that this criterion sounds like a brisk skip through the tulips of 2019 American culture. Hence the commentary on the significance of a narcissistic apocalypse. For the sake of this installment, we will have to approach narcissism with a more focused and laser beam view, since it is such a massive and multifaceted disease, and the subject group of topic is unique unto itself. We will only have time to address a certain type of narcissism, and that is somatic narcissism. According to Vaknin, the theorist behind the designation, somatic narcissists leverage their bodies, appearance, material assets, and mainly their sexuality to secure an uninterrupted flow of attention and adulation. We could look at this illness as a fertility goddess complex. Though men statistically exhibit pathological narcissism at a higher rate, as of recent, female narcissism has been on an alarming increase, especially due to the generational breakdown of the family causing increase in childhood abuse, as well as an overrepresentation of somatic narcissist types in entertainment and contemporary pop culture. Included with a full cultural takeover by social media platforms that have been scientifically proven to influence and cultivate narcissism, applications like Instagram and TikTok are of most influence currently. The emerging persona and histrionic identity of the IG thought is a great example of this. And the same behaviors, values, and messages are mirrored in a complementary fashion via mainstream and independent scene entertainment. The point being, somatic narcissism isn't merely a condition of the famous and disturbed, but it is now becoming a distinctive trait and attribute of the general public, and most importantly, the millennial and Z generations. What are the typical features of somatic narcissism? Though there is much overlap between men and women in expression of behavior traits, women seem to present more of a hypersexualized and seductive set of behaviors. More of what we would call histrionic traits seem to be present within somatic female thoughts. Histrionic behavior, borrowed from the traits of histrionic personality disorder, a subset of cluster B narcissistic patterns, is mainly described by an obsessive need of attention, positive or negative, with a preoccupation with the need to be the center of attention, coupled with exaggerated affect or inauthentic emotionality and dramatic behavior, followed by very seductive, sexualized, overall nature. The attention and status achieved through sexual seduction is the oxygen that the histrionic breathes. Though histrionics can display themselves in unique ways, they often boil down to either introvert or extroverted presentations. A good example here would be the difference between Ariana Grande and Miley Cyrus. Both, through their public displays, appear to demonstrate textbook examples of histrionic somatic narcissistic features, but both exhibit rather opposing styles of histrionic presentation. We will go into how these types of behaviors develop, but for this presentation we will focus on pointing out signs, symbols, and cultural significance within somatic narcissism. Somatic narcissists in pop culture entertainment typically display behaviors of a sex addict or the histrionic. One important point to make here is that sex addiction is always synonymous with narcissism. This goes with porn addiction and masturbatory fixations as well. These are all different signifiers of narcissistic illness. Though we also must mention that not all narcissists are sex addicts or porn addicts, but all sex addicts and porn addicts are inherently narcissistic. We will also eventually be going into the development of these toxic preoccupations as well, But let us continue. A glaring component of somatic narcissism is the obsession and distorted identification with one's body, properly termed dysmorphia. All narcissists suffer from dysmorphia to degrees, yet the somatic variety suffers in the most debilitating way. The current thought and processes thereof are imbued with identity and bodily dissatisfaction and confusion, or some level of body shape obsession. Most importantly, the body is always used to sexually seduce, sometimes in subtle ways, and in others overtly. But the body and appearance is always utilized and accentuated to garner attention or praise, envy, or lust. It becomes a source for and a gauge to determine self-value. Since the thought process is void of a complete and stable sense of self, a lack of depth, substance, and character, they resort to a base-level form of consciousness and identification. She becomes an object and objectifies herself in order to create a self, an image to provide some sense of meaning or purpose. The postmodern era thought of today is a somatoform, or a woman with warped body issues and a low sense of self-worth. Usually exaggerated, promoted, and accentuated for praise, the somatic narcissist hates their body, as they do themselves, and they leverage it like a tool to secure a false and sexualized sense of self-identity. Evidence for this idea is their exaggerated and distorted display of bodily proportions. They aim to advertise themselves as a caricature and not a natural human being, similar to a bulimic, a sufferer of anorexia, or the gear obsession of bodybuilding gym bros. The perfect body-fixated somatic narcissist is incapable of rationally perceiving the true state of their own bodies. In their eyes, it is always flawed and deviates from their twisted sense of perfection or cultural standard. Hence their obsessive motivation to enhance it, poke it, and fill it with substances, or purge, defile, and pervert their form until it appears to fit within the demented vision they faithfully nurse in their minds. What's worse is the trends that follow, by way of the halo effect and cult of personality and cult of celebrity. These dysmorphia-born demented visions become normalized into society and pop culture. Their cartoonish bodies are lusted after by the sexes for no good, healthy, or rational reason, and even mimicked and adopted by the narcissistic general population. Instagram has proven to maintain itself as the haven for mentally ill narcissistic somatoforms, offering up the perfect flesh marketplace for dopamine orgasms, a slot machine that doles out attention instead of coinage, a battleground for the false self, as we observe the thought process. They crawl and occupy social media feeds and story threads to be seen, revered, and reminded that they matter. Remind them that they are real and alive. They treat their face the same, like a detached edifice, an ornate storefront selling the goods, a prized bread-winning horse in the big race, beating their face, as it were. The somatic narcissist leverages their facial structure with elusive contour and exaggerated flair to again secure an uninterrupted supply of attention, adulation, and praise. The deep-seated insecurity of the narcissist needs a consistent stream of reassurance and acknowledgement. Hunting eyes and hearts, man-boys and the envy of other women. Casting out a net desperate to convince and re-establish the validity of their grandiose sense of self. Or garner compliments to appease the depravity of their permissive self-loathing. Empty inside, clueless to their true selves, the narcissist seizes their detached bodies as weapons of mass destruction, destruction of themselves and those whom they encounter, aimed at the masses, speaking in archaic, animalistic, base-level language. Their devices like cuneiform tablets, black mirrors, or a vanity set, while they look down at it compulsively. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all? The smartphone has become nothing but a mirror as we gaze into it, awaiting our audience to reflect our illusion, establish and validate our image, and define its value. But what about the distinctive behavioral degrees of dysmorphia? Two specific degrees appear to present themselves culturally. The first degree, one in which we see very typically on, say, Instagram, Snapchat, and the like, general superficial society, can be understood as the exhibitionist degree of dysmorphia, mainly detected by consistent levels of low self-esteem, chronic depression and anxiety, substance abuse, and addictive personality traits, as well as high levels of figure obsession, extreme fluctuation in looks and appearance. We could call this the hollow doll category of dysmorphia. Empty inside, obsessed and preoccupied with the labored management of the outside, the ornate edifice of image, the false image of self, superficial, shallow, simple-minded, and blemish-phobic. The hollow doll remains as the entry-level category of dysmorphic somatic narcissism. This first degree of dysmorphia is that in which threatens the development of very young, impressionable girls today, especially the 11 to 16-year-old ranges. Though somatic narcissism is not unique to females only. Just wait until we cover the male categories of somatic narcissism. This is when things get real interesting. But for now, let us continue. The second category of degree is a subclinical type of dysmorphia, detected by its more severe and obsessive nature. This degree would be termed fragile dysmorphia. Fragile describes the heightened degree of narcissism and lack of self and identity. What makes the fragile somatic narcissist stand out is their encompassing fixation on their bodies and appearances. So obsessive that in this degree we find the presence of not merely accentuation, as in the exhibitionist, but even augmentation and exaggerated enhancements. For instance, boob jobs, nose jobs, facelifts, butt shots, and excessive tattooing are all clear signs of fragile somatic narcissism. Usually following the exhibitionist stage, hereby investing in a diligent existence of body and image transformation, a life on stage, reshaping, remolding, and ever improving one's body and image to survive and feel real. The excessive and obsessive nature of their need to seduce and appeal to others is indicative of pathological narcissism, demonstrated by a hypervigilant attempt to be seen and coveted, which is a result of a massive void of self, fear of intimacy, and insecurity. Kim Kardashian and sisters would be the quintessential example of a fragile somatic narcissistic family. In fact, we are experiencing something called the Kardashian effect, whereby the somatic narcissistic dysfunction of an individual has been proselytized, monetized, and normalized into the greater part of society, such that this illness and sense of malignant self-regard has become cultural and ubiquitous, especially within the Generation Z and millennial populations. We are now witnessing a bodily dysmorphic culture of subclinical somatic narcissists. The Kardashian effect is demonstrated not only by its proselytizing fans and followers in the civilian world, but also through the factory-like production of dysmorphic clones in the entertainment world. For example, and likely the most influential Kardashian effect result to date, is Nicki Minaj, arguably the best example of the histrionic somatic narcissist we have at the moment. Minaj has seemed to apply a ruffian, primeval aspect to her narcissistic image. Jezebelian, one in which Kardashian does not seem to exhibit as such. This aspect is that of the more masculine narcissistic type, domineering and aggressive image. Here we discover the bad when the woman's nature becomes inverted. Ladies aim to think and behave as psychopathic and toxic male sex addicts. We can consider the term bad, for instance, bad entailing immoral and deviant, antisocial even, yet contingent on the presence of the word entailing the spirit of a degenerate dog, lowly hound, mongrel, a mutt whore off the leash, in heat. Unfortunately, by way of Minaj and many others, male and female, the hip-hop industry has become a mass meme, a degenerate gene that seems to have spread psycho-spiritual illness throughout society in less than a few decades. Like a disease, or planted seed, came many clones that have reified Nicki's nature and spirit, modified her allure and presence, but overall have assisted in inculcating society with a culture reference and initiation into the grips of psycho-spiritual narcissism. Cardi B, Iggy Azalea, Amber Rose, Black China are some typical examples. And for a more recent set of clones, we find contemporary histrionic thoughts like Doja Cat, Sweetie, City Girls, and of course, Megan Thee Stallion. Dysmorphic somatic narcissism has been demonstrated within our culturally consistent wave of dysfunctional entertainers since possibly Madonna or Lil' Kim. And even prior, say Marilyn Monroe, Betty Page, Bridget Bardot, Josephine Baker, Mae West, Jean Harlow, and of course, Pam Grier. The list is long and varies figure to figure, yet the dysfunctions, possessions, and preoccupations are cyclical and all the same. Again, we witness the modes of somatic narcissism through bouts of depression and self-loathing, emotional dysregulation, serial dating, infidelity, and patterns of toxic relationships. Fluctuating feelings of self-worth and image, the often histrionic, and even sometimes borderline, as with Lindsay Lohan, but always narcissistic. The somatic narcissist uses their sexuality, bodies, and image to seduce the world into loving them, supplying them provision, fame, power, and worldly comforts. Leveraging their appearances and sexual prowess and allure to secure an uninterrupted flow of attention and adulation. Arguably the most devastating and disconcerting category of entertainment somatic narcissism is that of pubescent somatic narcissism.
Give me your wallet.
Targeting young, impressionable children, the pubescent, pre and post, with sexually mature and adult-themed content. Today, we find a plethora of histrionic-type somatic narcissist artists that single-handedly shape and mold the next generations of young girls into their image. Bite-sized fertility goddesses posing as idols for the impressionable masses. As we mentioned earlier, Miley Cyrus and Ariana Grande currently occupy the most influential positions. But there are many other counterfeits and clones that have emerged from the damp and darkened woodworks. Somatic narcissism defines the character of modern female pop art and entertainment today. Dazed and confused, used and reused, addicts and erratic, the industry admits, regurgitates, pumps out, and supplies tragic acts like Lana Del Rey, Bella Thorne, Noah Cyrus, Halsey, Demi Lovato, Kylie Jenner, Katy Perry, Blackpink, Little Mix, and even some of the less sexualized, eclectic, and more cerebral type, also known as covert narcissists. These types tend to be more clever, show more depth, and more insight. One will stumble upon acts like Billie Eilish, Melanie Martinez, Kehlani, and Janelle Monáe, to name a few. Yet the clones continue. Regardless of how you slice it, our industries are crawling with the same type of malignant narcissistic spirit. The same type of degenerate gene that is generationally replicated, yet mutates into more sophisticated and distorted forms. For a historical view, the pubescent somatic narcissist entertainer seems to find its origin in acts such as Britney Spears, an updated and sexualized Debbie Gibson turned Lolita. Narcissism as a psycho-spiritual disease is not something new or emergent. It is ancient and an innate feature of human experience. Philosophically, or theologically, some would even compare it to the nature and disposition of an evil or devil-like character, namely Satan, given its connection to self-worship, harmful intent, and deception. We must also mention that narcissism, albeit pervasive in one's personality and culturally ubiquitous, finds its behavioral origins in a multitude of areas. It is not merely born in a vacuum, or simply induced through a hypnotic tune or hallucinogenic party drug, though these things can perpetuate predisposed narcissistic features. They do not pose as points of origin. Though narcissism is generally described as a developed response to childhood abuse, there is a genetic component of heritability that must be considered. Though scientific literature describes narcissistic traits as 20 to 54% genetically inherited, we can assess a specific study for reference. According to the Torgerson study of 2008 at the University of Oslo, 24% of narcissistic personality disorder traits were estimated to be inherited within the subject group. We must address the heritability of narcissism to counterbalance its developed capacity by way of abuse, as well as its learned capacities by way of culture. But when taking all in account, studies, history, and culture has demonstrated that, objectively, sustained abuse within childhood is the predominating factor behind narcissistic behavioral expression. Interestingly, and as a correlate, a great majority of somatoform celebs and entertainers come from broken homes and abusive childhoods, and suffer from many different types of addictions and drug abuse. With that being said, it would follow that those in the general population that are easily influenced by these artists and go as far to adopt and embody such behaviors very likely have a shared family and childhood past. Though the most one can do at this point is speculate on these ideas, the scientific literature, mental illness report rates, and our cultural debasement as an example seem to provide plenty of evidence to suggest these observations are accurate and affirmative. Possibly the epidemic and apocalypse we are undergoing is not regarding the death or undeath of one's body and mind, as in the state of a zombie. Better, we appear to be undergoing an epidemic of the self, the death of an authentic self, causing a disconnect from God, truth, and meaning, purpose. An existential dilemma of nihilism and hedonism, whereby the narcissist thrives most. A neoliberal dystopia, prideful, entitled, and exploitative. Leaving a mass of bloated avatars jousting for attention and power, whilst utilizing sexuality, their bodies, money, and delusion as a weapon, as their god. So a general example, these characteristics are typical of cluster B behavior, so mainly histrionic, narcissistic, borderline presentations. Their instability of self-image, instability of self-worth, make them especially prone to misjudge their bodies. Okay, so this is why we see them so preoccupied and obsessed with their appearance, because their self-worth, their self-image is unstable, so they're prone to constantly judging themselves, sometimes positively, like they may think they look good when they really look horrible, or negatively, they may look fine. They might look absolutely fine and they think they're ugly. They think they're fat, but they look totally okay. They look healthy, right? But to them, they're just like, no, something's wrong with me. So this is this whole idea that somatics suffer. It's always about the body, right? It's always about something's wrong with my appearance. Something's wrong with my shape. A general example is the somatic presumes themselves to be sexually irresistible. Here we're more speaking towards the histrionic type, the hypersexualized, like Kim Kardashian, right? A person that puts out sex tapes, you know, a person that has a long history of serial dating, a person that is literally a type of cultural prostitute. Great example of a somatic type. Not to mention she does the plastic surgery, she has all the body dysmorphia. It's really perfect example. But yeah, sexually irresistible, exuding sexuality, right? Statuesque in shape, right? Godlike in appearance, chiseled. Okay, you use that term. Oh, I want to be chiseled. This idea of chiseled or Coke body shape. These are all like ideals that kind of sets the tone for the somatic narcissist. Chiseled, Coke body shape, etc. This idea of Greek god, right? It's often referenced, the body of a Greek god, right? These are all different forms of somatic narcissistic perspectives. And people who are preoccupied, this is a good way to look at these things. Now, of course, anyone preoccupied with this stuff, they're not Christians. Okay, let's just get that straight, right? People who are just totally focused on all of these things, they're not Christians to begin with, even if they claim that they are. Okay, because this is flesh consciousness we're talking about here. All of this stuff is flesh consciousness. Right? It has nothing to do with the truth. It has nothing to do with the Most High God. It has nothing to do with Christ. It's all about achieving your own satisfaction, your obsession, your preoccupation with flesh. Anybody that's into this, anybody that's obsessed with being chiseled and Coke body or is constantly referencing these things, or is only attracted to certain types, or has some rubric for what beauty is. These are all different representations of somatic narcissism. Very easy to see. They dedicate immense time and effort and money, mind you. Okay, these people put a lot of money into this stuff. Okay, time, effort, money in altering their bodies just for the achievement of attention. Gym bros and bimbos, these are great examples of somatic narcissists. You go to the gym, you see all these, there's this archetype now, the gym bro, right? That's a perfect example of a somatic narcissist. And bimbos, these kind of bimbo type, very superficial, very stereotypical. The Stacys and the Chads. The Stacys and the Chads are great examples of somatic narcissists. And it's interesting how these characters, these archetypes, organically come about out of culture. The Stacys, the Chads, the incels, they've organically come out of culture. It's not like someone wrote this stuff. This is real reaction to society and the fallen nature of man. It's a real reaction, and it's fascinating to me how when they create these organic ideas, they perfectly equate to things like somatic narcissism, things like cerebral narcissism, things like spiritual possession. They perfectly align. They're just parallel with all of this stuff. It's really interesting. Yeah, they're masters of seduction. Okay, these people are masters of seduction. They're masters of sexual seduction mainly. And even they'll seduce you with their belongings. They'll seduce you with their cars. They'll seduce you with their brand names, right? They'll find some way to seduce you. It's all about seduction. It's about seducing you into giving them that attention. Very animalistic, predatorial, pathological, right? That's what they're about. Sex, attention, and the envy of others is a form of currency to them. Okay, it's even worth more than real currency. That's why they spend all their money on it. Money's nothing to them. They want the attention. They want the effect. They want the reaction. They want to see you walking with that $5,000 bag or that, you know, those exclusive Gucci shoes or whatever, right? They want to feed on that. They want to make you envious. See, the narcissist wants to make you jealous. The narcissist thrives on you envying them because they hate themselves. And the interesting thing about narcissism is that they play this game like they're so independent and they're so strong and they're so brave. We understand that's a facade. But what's deeper is these types are actually codependents. The narcissist of all types. Doesn't matter what type, introverted, extroverted, vulnerable, grandiose, they're all codependent. They rely on your attention. They rely on your perspective of them. They rely on how you perceive them. Without you, they disappear. It's fascinating. They're compulsive consumers. Compulsive consumers of compliments, of praise, and of attention. Cars, clothing, lavish, party life, luxury. Lifestyles of the rich and famous. I mean, do you guys remember this show? I mean, it really popularized the idea of being rich and famous and being cool, and everyone wants to be like you. And then you add in the beauty. Really, really interesting how they were pushing this kind of stuff a long time ago. It breeds the ideals, it breeds the worldview into the rest of society. So that's what's dangerous about promoting narcissism, is some people are predisposed to narcissistic behaviors based on their upbringing. A great majority of people are, to some degree, predisposed to some of these behaviors. Now, when they're brought up in a culture that just embodies all of these behaviors, promotes all of this stuff, they're susceptible to it and they fall into it and they become stuck in the flesh, depressed, anxious, suicidal ideation, all of these things, right? Hollywood, the music industry, pretty much thrive on somatic narcissism. That's why I think it's important to even mention it, because our entertainment industries thrive on this specific type of narcissism. Online, especially YouTube, is brimming with somatic narcissists. And then you look at the IG models, Instagram, brimming with somatic narcissists. And the beauty industry, okay, the makeup and body modification industry. You know, now you got guys involved with this. It's like they live their life to paint their face. It's such a massive industry, and all they do is paint their face, and they try to make themselves look different by contour. There's this whole contour movement where all these girls, they're just so obsessed with like changing their shape of features and manipulating your perception of their features by putting makeup in certain ways that makes them appear in their eyes, or basically to their standard, more beautiful, right? And of course, I know they're trying to appeal to symmetry. I get it. There is this real component of form called symmetry, and the more symmetric a face is, the more attractive it appears. I understand the science of it, but it becomes narcissistic when practicing this type of face painting becomes basically your identity. Right? It becomes a part of your self-esteem. It's now, every girl that wears makeup is not a narcissist. I'm not saying this, but what I'm saying is when you get into the depths of some of this, it's highly narcissistic, especially the Instagram models and the YouTube makeup artists and these makeup gurus and stuff. Really, really wild stuff, especially when you get the guys involved with this, these men, these boys, these whatever they are. They're highly possessed. They suffer from serious illnesses, and somatic narcissism is the perfect type of narcissism that they struggle from. The specific type. It's very sensory focused, very body, appearance, flesh focused. If a man's art is a reflection of his being, the example from that which comprises his mind, his fears, his passions, or his unique gifts to the world, and this art becomes an art form, a metaform that contains the power to shape and reform the collective the man partakes in, how then can we rightfully divide the man from this art, an art form from society? How can we parse out this seemingly symbiotic ecosystem of art and man, art form, and culture? Has the art become the society? Has the man been replaced by the art? Has the medium truly become the message? Has life and society become but an art form reflected, a systematic shuffling of curated images, no longer an authentic existence with direction and meaning, but a spectacle, a free-form social relation among people mediated by images? If so, who is this man? And from which realm have these images and this art bloomed? Art, like any other particular within this world, can be a cure or a curse, a weapon for good, a weapon for evil. Given this, one should always assess the creator, the craftsman, and his message, his foundation of most importance, because his base stabilizes that which he builds. If art form has become the house we now live in, let us be sure its foundation is secure and whole. But what we also discover is that the wickedness of man is great in the earth, and every imagination of the thoughts of his heart is only depraved continually. Is this the same man behind this said art form? This medium conjoined to its spurious message? Should we not be weary of such a possibility? Is there not cause for concern? Has this art form finally presented the alchemic marriage, the non-binary fusion of above and below, the Dionysian bathhouse of baptism? Has Thotiana and Thotimus re-established the pantheon of this world and rejuvenated the loins of its proles? What say you, Thotimus? And what role do you play? What's fascinating about postmodern pop culture today is its unbridled ignorance and naive sense of even its most tacit and obvious representations. Thought culture, for instance, or the consensus on slang terminology, its meanings and taxonomy, and all the patterned behavioral archetypes that follow. They have no real conception of what they believe in, essentially. They have no clear understanding of their own behaviors, wants, and primitive desires. Like feral animals, they frolic and spew. Like wind-up toys or battery-powered trinkets, they click and clack about, sputtering a broken language they create as they go, or learn as they attend to their culture, taken by the whims of emotion and libido. Here the clueless and rabid masses construct a disembodied and brave new world. The interesting aspect of it all is that their cultural behaviors and compulsions are extremely easy to describe through different forms of psycho-spiritual pathology. If they only knew that much of their trends and postures accurately describe verifiable examples of pathological mental illness.
Right. Crazier than crazy.
Documented sets of toxic behaviorism, and types of activity found in demonology. As we witness the inversion of the sexes and merging of the genders, we also discover a pathology within public behavior. As a culturally dominating feature, we can see somatic narcissism restructuring the order and direction of things, foreshadowing things to come, while disintegrating things that once were. Thotimus, we will call him, or the postmodern male of today's popular culture, is a great example of the pathological somatic narcissist. At times grandiose, and in others more vulnerable or covert, the somatic type of narcissistic male is all-encompassing and permeates the structure of what we once knew as masculinity. In fact, and to be clear, there is very little masculine about the postmodern male today. Often described as toxic masculinity, alpha male, or chauvinistic, male culture today is not masculine at all. It has become an inversion of masculinity, a distortion of its principles, similar to how femininity has experienced an inverse treatment.
As a butch woman, and dating has been awesome.
For me, it's about being dominant.
Sex toys just totally aren't my jam. As a butch woman, I like to use my hands.
The somatic narcissistic male of today is a pseudo-alpha specimen, coupled with a sensual beta-type nice guy specimen, a weak, emotionally unstable, and insatiable childlike being. Both, and to varying degrees, pursue the life of a false self, consumed by self-deprecation or grandeur, pornographic obsessions, and a reliance on the acceptance of others. The postmodern male of contemporary culture is an impotent lout, a parasitical growth within the bloodstream of our species, threatening its survival. The most troubling aspect of this condition is that it appears to have been procured and rolled out by design, and now promoted through mass distributed media screens, commercial product marketing, network news, and mainstream broadcasting of all configurations. The pseudo-alpha male and the sensual beta-type male have, in exchange for authentic masculinity, become the rubric for a new manly duplicity and postmodern manhood in general. A double-minded man, unstable in all of his ways. Thotimus reigns as the pantheon phallic god of the pseudo-alpha male variety, the shallow and desperate man-boy of low character and resolve, that thinks between his legs and bears little fruit above the neck. We find most of his attributes fashioned through the sentiments of the hip-hop culture, a modern musical paganistic sex cult that hides its spells and rituals behind hypnotic beat algorithms and further disguises itself in superficial appeals to ethnic pride and a universalist shared identity. But if we were to be honest, we would have to locate its true genesis within the 70s blaxploitation film. Here we find the lowest and most exploitative aspects of inner-city black culture catapulted into mainstream society. Draped over the eyes of viewing audiences, decorating the next generations with the perfect urban regalia to demonstrate they are down and hip, cool, and later, about it. A long drawn-out succession of depraved, degenerate, and overall counterproductive elements of black culture has eroded sensibility and virtue within the mass socio-cultural milieu, and in response, has systematically redefined the behavior of its citizens, and moreover, popularized, monetized, and lionized a new representation of the popular man. A residue that has rubbed off and accumulated itself, growing more and more deranged over time. Though there are many facets within the deconstruction of the natural masculine. For instance, dysregulated socioeconomics, usurpation of naturalism over Christianity, technological progress over moral foundation, quantification over qualification, narcissism over community, state over family. The list is long, and all play their specific roles succinctly. But of most salience to the postmodern eye is the conspicuous projection of mass media pop culture and the deep-seated messages therein. The new popular man of cool, sexually omnipotent and irresistible, detached and cunning, smooth yet hard as granite. The popular man demonstrates all the specific facets of the somatic narcissist. An alpha male minus all of its virtue and character, rendering him a pseudo-version, plastic, tacky, and glib. Detached from a true self in exchange for an image, detached from his own body, such that it becomes an inanimate object that he wields like a sword, not for fun, but for his own imaginary survival, to slay his prey and exhibit his dominance over all that he hates and despises, all that repeatedly remind him of his true impotence. His entitlement turns to murder as a recompense, a reimbursement for things ungiven, fulfilling the massive black hole within him. Thotimus is a fiend of the libido, a slave to it. He is an autoerotic sex addict. In lieu of a body to manipulate, his libidinous drive seeks an outlet, anxiety relief. So he turns to pornographic imagery and manual self-gratification. The homosexual act of masturbatory fixation. Postmoderns today endear the act with the term fapping, an act once designated to pubescent boys in hormonal transient stages, has now become culturally ubiquitous, cross-generational, and overall pathological. Amidst a neo-age of weak and deracinated men who today seem to encounter life similar to children, a strain of cultural neoteny sets in, whereby arrested development is normative and behaviors of earlier stages in life are retained, reconstituted, and practiced habitually. This new atomized culture and deracinated men and women create a void within them where substance and meaning is to exist. A state of existential dread ensues. Therefore, they inherently default to the lowest common denominator for direction and satiety. They default to their base level understanding, the flesh, sexual stimulation, sexuality as a philosophy to life, and filter through which one experiences it. This lifestyle, rid of direction, order, and moral foundation, waxes one cold, aloof, naive, and susceptible to the darkest natures of mankind. A good example of the result of this dynamic is the archetype of Thotimus, the sometimes pseudo-alpha, other times sensual and soft beta type. Thotimus takes on many presentations and expressions, but his lowly spirit of pride, lust, and depravity infiltrates all forms. He resembles the behavior of a vampire, surviving on the lifeblood of others, yet never truly resuscitates his own deadness, merely feeding for the sake of feeding, yet never feeling satisfied. He objectifies himself in the same way he objectifies others. He aims to be the object of desire to his audience. That very audience becomes an object as well. People become interchangeable mirrors, discarded when they give the wrong reflection, and idolized when they reciprocate admiration and perfection. To Thotimus, people are sources of narcissistic supply. props on the set of his grandiose feature presentation. He is the writer, director, and lead role, the auteur. All the world is a stage, and the cheers, sneers, and lights breathe in him life. As people become objects, their quantification becomes crucial. The more the merrier, the less the more depressed. Hereby existence becomes a numbers game. Likes, followers, bed notches, and hopscotch dating options. Existence becomes a competition. One-upmanship supplies him points and therefore purpose. He is being seen. His life depends on it. Existence becomes the sole pursuit of being noticed and coveted. The spectacle of the self. A cheater, a liar, a thief in the night that revels in the despair and misfortune of others. Puffed up and godlike, he aims for henosis, a union with divinity. Through theurgy, he achieves a false sense of godhood. Theurgy being his craft, his ritual, the art form. How about some early examples of the thoughtomist archetype in popular culture? Rather, male proto-thoughts of our generations that have, along with their female counterparts, posed the confluence of gender-specific somatic narcissism in entertainment culture. Further, imposing a new libidinal image of man and woman, allure over substance, sensual influence through seduction, manipulation, and promotion of image replaced that which was once expected and appreciated in the character of man and woman. Several influential and classic alpha-type examples of thoughtomists would be James Dean, Elvis Presley, Paul Newman, Sesu Hayakawa, Melvin Van Peebles, Shaft and Dolomite, Richard Gere, Burt Reynolds and Tom Selleck, Fabio, and Antonio Banderas. Examples of more beta-type male thoughts would be Rudolph Valentino, Rob Lowe, and Johnny Depp, to name a few. But the male thought of today seems to be much more influenced by the music industry than Hollywood. Though they both play a part, currently young men today seem to demonstrate a postmodern hip-hop induced variety of male degeneracy. With that being said, it would only be right if we look back into some early music cultural influences that have manufactured the contemporary male thought of today. Music and its strategically designed artists have always had its seductive and libidinal influence on its audiences. Performance art in general has demonstrated this component. Vaudeville, for instance, which one could argue single-handedly laid the foundations for the porn industry that would develop decades later. The art form here seems to provide a type of trance-like experience through auditory forms, and mixed with specific messages and images. Certain moods are then created, reactions and behaviors are then produced by way of those moods. Here we find a stimulus-reaction cycle in entertainment music that can be described as libidinal induction through hypnosis. The libido, or sexuality, plays as the linchpin within the process of the entertainment-born stimulus-reaction cycle. This specific cycle is that which has not only been used to popularize entertainers and musical brands through seduction, but resulted in a cultural affect that mirrors the messages and libidinous nature of the entertainment. Simply put, degenerate music has exacerbated degeneracy in culture by reinforcing its affect through repetitive exposure. And not just repetitive exposure alone, but repetitive exposure across demographics through cross-generational indoctrination. A little something for mom and dad, grandpa, grandma, and a little more for the kids. Many movements have utilized this hypnotic cycle for influence culturally, with libidinal influence being the standard mode of attention. Let us point out some high points of indoctrination historically. The modern thoughtomist of the hip-hop variety has a rich historical development. Of course, we must always begin the libidinal disturbance in culture with the sexual revolution of the 60s era counter-cult.
You know what I mean? You talk about the hippie. What is the hippie? Where does that name come from, hippie? Why don't you talk about the younger generation, the people who are changing? Why don't you talk about the people who know what's happening and don't agree with the old line of thinking? Why don't you talk about the people who believe in brotherly love and nothing else, and prove it every day on Haight-Ashbury?
Here, the confluence of sexual and value promiscuity, drug abuse, unbridled pursuits of pleasure, and passive leisure uprooted all semblance and order within humanity, kicking off a greater path of deconstruction and derailment of human existence on Earth. Starting with attacking the libido, human direction and human potential was seized rather easily and placed on a track of a single mode. An obsession and preoccupation with sexual stimulation of the loins and drug-induced activity within the brain replaced all of which comprised God's creation. A new aimless direction, a new intangible purpose. The Jezebelian spirit of Thotiana and Ahabian or Dionysian spirit of Thotimus was thoroughly rampant throughout the earth. Soon this counter-cult would transform into Uranian dens of bacchanal, raging druggy and orgy groups, like the factory of Andy Warhol, or the developing disco era, which provided Studio 54, Bacchanalia in White Nose and Numbface. How does all of this relate to the current Thotimus of today? Well, where do you think hip-hop got its start? Why, yes, the disco era, and its culture birthed the first representations of the hip-hop movement. Though it is taught that Kool Herc and this one-man band organization spawned the art, it is rarely taught where most of its music was experienced, and where most early popular rap acts were allowed to perform. The dark and dreary homosexual dens and bars that reside within and adjacent to the inner city communities. Turbo Thought and blistering somatic narcissist Grace Jones had her start behind the same walls and was part of the same movement. At this time, proto-hip-hop culture and disco funk culture were synonymous, and in many ways, so were their messages. Sexual ambiguity, androgyny, illicit and customary drug use, buttressed by flagrant narcissism, the children of the counterculture, disco, funk, and hip-hop slowly transformed the nature of the popular man, more and more. By the early 80s, we would receive acts like Too Short. We could consider this figure Thotimus Prime, forming what I term the neo-blaxploitation movement. Too Short reintroduced the spirit of Superfly, the Mac, and Big Willie into the budding inner-city black rap culture, playing on the characters and being influenced by local heroes within his native Oakland and Outer Bay Area. Too Short turned out many young and up-and-coming boys, turning them into quintessential examples of grandiose, woman-hating, woman-using, attention-seeking, somatic narcissists. The postmodern deranged, libidinous male. This movement would dovetail with other areas of entertainment and reconstitute its allure and message. Later, we would be exposed to acts like 2 Live Crew, Naughty by Nature, Snoop Dogg, and many, many others that passed on the somatic tradition of Thotimus to younger and next generation boys. With a strong emphasis on glorified violence and pride, hyper-narcissism and sexual omnipotence, the popular male has undergone much manipulation and transformation by way of hip-hop culture. It has bled into all facets of popular culture in general, and takes on a symbolic role in all regions of entertainment. cross-generational, and non-discriminatory. Hip-hop culture has demonstrated itself to be a mass meme, an egregore of degenerate measure, lurking, feeding, transmuting, and distorting culture from a position of now omnipresence. Hence the debilitation of the modern man to postmodern man, masculine male to feminized man-child, sex-obsessed, drug-addicted, bird-brained proletariat. The simple question may come down to, generally speaking then, what is a thought? Let's first start by taking the general population consensus. According to the Urban Dictionary, thought means a hoe or a harlot. To flesh this out further, we can refer to its Chicago origins, where we discover in fact that the word thought, T-H-O-T, is an acronym standing for that hoe out there or that hoe over there. Remains as a phrase that comprises the means of categorization for a less than respectable woman, a lady of the night, or a maiden loose in the pants and moral capacity, a female that is defined by and understood through her pathological behaviors that are solely of a sexual nature. A lady, woman, or girl preceded by, preoccupied, and obsessed with her experience, sensation, and utilization of her genitals in relation to self and others. Very little depth, character, integrity, nor virtue are discovered in the general thought archetype. Though we have discovered this archetype has been defined as exclusive to the female, it would be wrong and inaccurate for us to accept this short-sighted definition, since it is evident that this same set of values and pathologies are found in men and expressed in similar ways. Male thoughts and female thoughts exist and are growing in number at a rapid rate. Moreover, it is not any issue of gender that we need to address here, but it is the set of values, dispositions, and behavioral pathology that underpins thoughtery in general that calls for an in-depth assessment. Included, we will attempt to address the several key factors or events that demonstrate an influential relationship to the development of thought-like behavior and thoughty lifestyles. I maintain, and as a hypothesis or held contention, that the thought archetype is but an indirect or incidental pop culturally born euphemism for subclinical somatic narcissism. Point being, the boundless depravity and feral nature of pop culture has devolved itself so that it has organically produced a definitive set of behaviors that align with a specific type of mental illness pathology, verbatim. And that pathology, I maintain, is that of somatic narcissism. Within that pathology, we find both varieties of narcissistic expression, those being based in either an introverted or extroverted temperament. Covert, also known as vulnerable narcissism for the introverted, and grandiose or overt narcissism for the extroverted. In many cases, especially those of higher severity and clinically diagnosable, one will find expressions of both covert and overt narcissism. Typically comorbid in these presentations, one will discover elements of cluster B behaviors in men and women. What is the simple point being made here? Overall, what popular culture today deems as the thought is theoretically a provincial take on something extremely sophisticated and well documented. My hypothesis is simply that the thought is merely a slang description or strictly symbolic example of the cluster B personality, and namely, a somatic narcissist. And just like this cluster B personality spectrum varies in its expression, locations, and demographics, so does the behavior set within thoughthood. All thoughts aren't the same. They all do not walk, talk, and look alike. Thoughtery is not age, race, gender, class, or orientation specific, nor is the condition permanent. Though, they speak the same language. There exists a shared libidinal disposition, a shared language rooted in the dissonance of hypervanity and esteem deficiency, self-aggrandizement or self-loathing, grounded in the preoccupation and misconception of one's core self and authentic feelings. And from the thought archetype as an example, this dissonant identity and libidinal disposition is observably demonstrated by the symptoms of somatic narcissism. If a thought is merely a hoe or a harlot, then we must extrapolate from those terms all of which they describe, and that which they describe are much more than things exclusive to the female or even to the basic act of sexual intercourse. How did that whore become a whore? How did she develop such a propensity for self-loathing and masochism? From where did she learn these behaviors, or from what have these behaviors sprung? And from whom did she ascertain her values, or lack thereof? Meaning, a whore is not just a woman, or a woman that has promiscuous sex. She is a person, a creation of God, with a history, an experience in life that has led her to her present destination and disposition. Included, a man as well plays a part as a whoremonger, a womanizer, or sexual fiend described in the archetype of Thotimus. Also a person, a creation of God, with a history, and an experience in life that has led him to his present destination and disposition. We understand the nature of narcissism within the thought, but what about its nurture? The environmental influence that plays a key role in developing the thought behavior. Is a thought as simple as pop culture attempts to describe it? A hoe? A promiscuous woman?
When I got on stage, their reaction when I walked on stage and I took my top off, it was that reaction. I live for that every day.
That reaction, I live for that every day.
It seems this premature and lacking explanation boils thoughtery down to unrestrained and habitual knocking of boots. But this all does not simply stop at rootless and animalistic sexual depravity, but it entails motives to that depravity, antecedents of that hypersexual behavior, experiential points of reference throughout one's life that contributes to them, like abuse and trauma, socioeconomic foundations that also pile on influence, whether indigence or affluence. There are also family and value constructs, and of course there is the identity and the inconsistent or patchy development of the self. All of these variables combined formulate the makeup of one given to the ways of thoughtery, the true composition of the harlot and whoremonger, the rubric to thoughthood by ways of Thotimus and Thotiana, the narcissistic personality in pop terminological form. People do not just become thoughts overnight. There appears to be a multifaceted combination of many variables and events that lead one to this condition. Many different areas seem to disrupt or break down one's ability to properly develop and understand themselves, as well as accurately perceive themselves in relation to others. Included is the disruption or breakdown of their capacity to accurately understand the world around them. These disruptive areas mainly consist of trials, experiences, and events created within our given environments. How about some examples of these events or experiences? An event would be one that relates to our immediate familial setting or dynamic of upbringing, our social group, culture, institutions and industries, and epistemology, or our collective basis for general knowledge. If events with these areas are assisting in the proliferation of normative narcissism today, and narcissism is theoretically described as a behavioral response to trauma, we then can consider these events as traumatic events. Events in which we experience that are traumatic to the point of inducing a narcissistic reaction. How so? Through a trauma that is experienced over time, reactionary pathologies are formed in response. According to the research literature, narcissism appears to be one of those natural human tendencies to protect oneself from abusive experiences. And through repetition and the systematization of these reactive tendencies, a pathology or behavioral pattern can develop. When observing the systematic exposure of these abusive experiences in society, followed by the observable narcissistic reactions to them, we can theorize, based on an observable correlation, that these events are contributing to the current condition of the public mind. Then further, through socio-cultural influence, these tendencies are often rewarded, reciprocated, promoted, and appropriated within the given environment, whereby narcissism becomes a trend, a praised attribute, and mirrored behavioral set amongst peers. Therefore, creating and resulting in a cultural cycle of pathological narcissism, one that is observable and available for study and analysis. Let us go over several of these events and areas of social experience that seem to facilitate this culture-born condition. A key sustained traumatic event that facilitates the development of pathological narcissism is familial abuse and the influence of family dynamics, mainly forms of sexual, physical, or emotional abuse, coddling, and neglect as well. We must make the distinction between NPD and clinically disordered families from subclinical or non-diagnosable yet highly narcissistic family environments. A narcissistic family is not always led by sufferers of full-on mental disorders, hence the subclinical designation, but can readily display highly narcissistic behavior. Behaviors that transfer debilitating abuse to their children, therefore stunting their self-development and diminishing their ability to become healthy and stable adults. This type of subclinical, non-diagnosable narcissistic family has been extremely common in the 20th and 21st centuries and passes on its traits and behaviors generation to generation. CPTSD, or complex post-traumatic stress disorder, is currently the agreed upon condition for disturbed, troubled, or struggling children and adults who were raised in these types of families. Children and adults who are perceived to be affected by this condition are said to suffer from immutable low self-esteem, inability to sustain intimacy, and or blocked paths to self-understanding, grouped with chronic depression, anxiety and indecisiveness, addictive personalities, high impulsivity, and desperate needs of approval and validation. They typically suffer from impulsive and erratic relationships with what is termed the Big Three, one being the base triad, sex, drugs, and alcohol, two being food, and three, money or spending. Their proclivity to addictive personalities in general will detail a multitude of fixations that do not always adhere to the so-called Big Three. For instance, fixations like video game addiction, hypochondria, and obsessive-compulsive behaviors are very common as well. So what is a non-diagnosable or subclinical narcissistic family? And what makes it stand out from diagnosable narcissistic personality disorder traits? Well, to keep this simple, we can detect the presence of a narcissistic family by specific, staunch, pervasive, and enduring traits that are present. Regardless of the presence or absence of overtly identifiable narcissistic abuse like physical or sexual, an underlying rule within the narcissistic home prevails as a standard and rubric to child rearing and family structure. This underlying, unspoken rule and enduring trait is that the needs of the parent system, or parents in general, take precedence over the needs of the children. The needs of the children are not only secondary to those of the parent, but are often seriously problematic or burdensome to the parent or parents. For instance, The emotional, financial, or social problems of the parent will take precedence over the emotional, physical, or instructional needs of the child. The preoccupied and self-obsessed parent never seems to have the time, concentration, or emotional capacity to authentically engage with the child's needs. Furthermore, the responsibility of needs fulfillment shifts from the parent to the child. The child is then forced to ignore their own needs and confusions in reaction to them noticing the parent's needs and issues are more important and granted true attention and energy instead. Here the child learns to play the role of the mirror or the reflection of the parent and internalizes a reactive identity opposed to a proactive one. The child's identity is rooted in an approval-based behavior and dependent on his acceptable reactions to the parent's ego needs and desires to assist the parent in maintaining a good mood, social role, or stable identity. Whilst swallowing, burying, or sublimating their own true self. From this point forward, the child is barred from developing a stable identity of their own, and develops a false sense of self as a sacrifice and ransom for the broken self of the parent. In this dynamic, the child either becomes parentified or parents the parent, and or neglected, shunned, or conversely, put on an unrealistic pedestal, becoming a type of trophy or prize, an objectified hood ornament of the family automobile. Hereby, the child is rendered to an object, and extension of the parent system, a mirror reflection of the parent's worldview, the mini-me in mommy's pumps. She is more of a doll than a daughter. He is daddy's victory over old losses. He is more of a vicarious avatar than a son, a required pendant for the parent's identity, a checks and balancing system for their ego, a pillar and footstool for their own esteem, or in some cases a rub and pain, a taxing burden on their ambitions and selfish preoccupations.
Sweetheart, look, why do you think I carry your baby picture in my wallet?
That's not me, Dad.
That's the picture that came with the wallet.
Hey, when I bought this wallet...
Simply put, narcissistic families are more concerned with appearing or feeling like good parents than actually practicing good parenting. They are more preoccupied with the discomforts of life while parenting than genuinely concerned with their duty of shaping proper development during childhood. Or they inherently never wanted to be parents in the first place and simply tolerate their children as they do the weather, traffic, or migraine headaches, as strenuous, unavoidable, stumbling blocks of life, or tokens, precious metals with ameliorating powers that make one's loathed life worth living. They either swallow the child or play hide and seek, pretending to be invisible. Therefore, the child grows as a reflective and reactive subparticle of the family, an all-or-nothing afterthought. Never a true individual with authentic personhood, but a sidekick, a project piece or frame on the wall of a vapid and superficial home. The child is then, and throughout adulthood, debilitated in any true sense of healthy development. But it is also important to mention that the formation and proliferation of narcissism is enigmatic and hard to pinpoint. For instance, abusive families produce perfectly healthy and stable children, while perfectly stable families can produce abusive and disordered children. Nature-nurture dynamics, predestined orders of God, as well as developmental interactions between varying personality types seem to provide the most accurate explanation for this perplexing arrangement. Just because one has been raised in an abusive family does not guarantee that one will develop such disruptive psycho-spiritual conditions. Nor does stable and consistent family life promise stable and consistent adulthood. There are many factors at play, and exceptions are always considered. Yet it is the rule in which we are discussing here that appears to be having the greatest negative effect on the public mind and society as a whole. Another important traumatic event for the populace is the ongoing and systematic presence of 21st century technological conditioning. Corporate state interest funding and globalist fashioned oligarchy form a structural technopoly, a digital gated system that shapes behavior and modifies the public domain en route to meet technopolic needs via software, resulting in austerity, collective utilitarianism, scientism, and humanism, infoglut, and dopamine marketing, accompanied by neoliberal groupthink and alternative lifestyles, and buttressed by consumer-based living. Society, mankind, and the earth is mechanized and atomized, deracinated, and uprooted. Examples of this technopoly framework is discovered through the likes of intrusive and conditioning-based smart technology, social and economic AI management systems, and algorithmic societal maintenance and industry management. Here we discover an event that, similar to how the narcissistic family renders the child to an object, technocratic narcissism renders the human being to a piece of software, quantifiable numbers and symbols. Here we get the idea of Schaeffer's concept of the particulars, or Ellul's concept of the means, where man no longer knows his ends and becomes the means for which have no direction, an object or means for the fantastical and dystopian ends of the state. Man becomes a food, a cog, a parasitic flesh bag of cells only interested in feeding, empty and lost, blind and aimless. All for them from here, the proles and eaters. All that is left is desire, novelty, leisure, and time. Then imagine mixing this with exaggerated amounts of useless information, also known as infoglut, and useless material products. Endless opportunities to escape into fantasy worlds, simulations, nihilistic virtual communities, and avatar saloons.
Media real quick, because I need as much social media action as I can get. Oh, my lights just went out again. Power has been shut off. Pay your bills. Where are my bills? They're out here. Pay rent. There we go. Rent only $4.50. That's not even that bad.
Whereby the destruction of natural human engagement ensues. Relationships become business transactions. Getting to know one another becomes a shallow game of show and tell. Love becomes but a mystification, a religious ritual of you show me yours and I'll show you mine, until I am bored. As we spin the bottle on Tinder and cancel plans for dinner, we slowly become less human and begin to resemble the rote functioning of the devices we carry in our pockets. Tending to our vices and compulsions, changing the images of man as our endless feeds supersede our deepest needs. A society that no longer reads but can bleed bandwidth and type for hours a day with only their thumbs. Imagine a world where all of this exists, in concert, in ballroom dance attire, taking to the wind in full spin and embrace. Well, you get the prelude to the year 2020, the perfect environment for the dehumanization of God's glorious creation. Therefore, honoring the prince of this world and air, finally proliferating the malignant narcissistic personality throughout the earth. Next on the list of events is the power of industry and entertainment's cognitive manipulation, signified through the music industry, network news, Hollywood, and corporate-funded online media. Here we find the true battleground for mind and spirit of humankind. Mobilized and propagated through the tools of technopoly, the populace's passions are seized, and it willfully chooses its master, vacuous and rabid, lying down its life for the onerous task of death. Let us also consider the event of epistemology. Though technology media plays a huge role in that regard, the academic system has remained as a destructive force within the path of rational and virtuous human development. We can consider the negative effect of compulsory junk education systems that have moreover socialized and modified society instead of provided it in-depth learning capacities and classical and historical knowledge, and most importantly, a stabilizing foundation in the providence and truth of the Creator God and the finished work of Christ, through which mankind can understand, appreciate, and logically approach a fulfilling life. It moreover has remained as a statist system of humanist re-education facilities set out to manufacture uniform social groups and populations of malleable, predictable, basic functioning things instead of actual living people with sincere character and understanding, spirit, and authentic personage. Lastly, and I would say of most importance, this idea leads us directly to the concept of personal worldview, philosophical position or value system of the individual. That which comprises the self, the root and starting point of it all. As they say, if you knew better, you would do better. But it seems today we know more than we ever have. The information age has granted us intellectual license to dictate reality as we see it. Yet we still choose to behave in ways that are counterproductive to life and contradictory to what is right, moral, rational, and true. Have we learned to behave this way? Or has it always been part of the fallen nature of man? To put it another way, is family, society, technology, or culture creating a generational pool of narcissistic personalities? Or is the human by its nature, and when given conducive environmental conditions, inherently susceptible to pathological patterns of narcissism? Though a clear relationship between the two is present, the latter appears to be of deepest truth and evidence for our condition today. Hence our day of man being a lover of himself, a lover of pleasure rather than God. Covetous and proud in their affections, here we live in a fallen world amidst its inhabitants of fallen nature that are routinely encouraged to be self-conscious and practice a labored self-scrutiny that destroys any semblance of authenticity, any glimmer of spontaneity. All becomes a trite performance, to compete, to subsist, to exist. We all dance together trying to impress each other, yet despise and ignore one another's presence in fear of losing step of a perceived status or value. A plastic wall divides us all, further blinding our gaze and exaggerating our gait. We move with purpose, with the purpose of moving others, in which does the opposite of bringing them closer, by moving them further away. All of us actors and spectators alike live surrounded by mirrors. Advertising, technology, and entertainment manipulates and handles these mirrors. As cracked and worn as they are, since children they are all that life has seemed to be worth. As they say, you only live once, and since nothing truly matters, you might as well fake it till you make it, while ignoring the fact that what is effectively made is ostensibly fake. We live in a day when the creation disputes the creator is the highest form of being. Stripped of its tenets, simply being merely becomes creative, and the creation of the false self becomes the highest form of creativity. So why the focus on thoughtery? Why the thought analysis? Isn't this whole idea of the thought juvenile and just an expected product of the present generation's youth culture? Well, I would describe this perspective as not only avoidantly dismissive, but ignorant, mainly by ignoring the many signs and symbols that this thought archetype has provided us as a type of window to the current social and spiritual state. I see the thought archetype as something much more than just some silly new trend presented by the kids. There's always been trends. Every generation has their version. But this one's a bit different. And actually, it demonstrates a deep falling away of society that differentiates itself from others in the past, or the popularizing and normalizing of the nature that promotes that falling away. And what differentiates it, I would say mainly we could put on the shoulders of technology. We've always been fallen, we've always been creating negative and detrimental culture, but through this new type of technology, the spreading or reconstitution of this type of culture is increased. The archetype basically points a finger at something bigger, right? I think this is pointing a finger at something much bigger, like mental illness or lack of spiritual awareness, lack of self-awareness, and emotional, sexual, as well as identity dysfunction. Moreover, an all-encompassing trend of these things. This thought culture seems to demonstrate the concert of these things. Furthermore, I see this somewhat isolated, debased, and absurd national trend as a symbolic example of a deeper international epidemic. Just because something is camp or provincial doesn't mean it is void of much deeper implications. Superficial and novel things in many cases can describe much more than their surfaces present when uncovered or analyzed with honest intellectual curiosity. Also, I wanted to attempt to highlight some ideas, and I do understand and am well aware that the great majority of society has very little understanding of what narcissism truly is. We can even admit within its own field of study, it is perplexing and antagonistic. It's an ongoing mission of understanding, still attempting to put together all of its multifaceted pieces. Similar to biology and its understanding of brain function, or science in general and its understanding of consciousness, or morality for that matter. Quantifying and materialistic or empirical methods cannot accurately describe qualitative and metaphysical concepts. It is important to understand this, mainly because today in our contemporary state, these quantifying methods are all that are utilized and appropriated. Aside from neoliberal anti-science movements, of course. To me, this seems to have a great deal to do with the reason for so much confusion and ignorance in our population. Back to the subject, narcissism is truly an enigma. And I would say, similar to contemporary scientific difficulties with concepts of morality and brain function or consciousness, narcissism is beyond concrete material understanding. Possibly these concepts remain in their essences as maybe described by Kant, forms of noumena, things that are independent of perception by our senses, things that we can claim exist yet cannot prove through our sensory capacities. Actually, it reminds me of something like the Holy Spirit or faith. Blind knowing, the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And though we can collect data and aggregate behavior patterns in shared groups, observe replicable patterns in societies, put value judgments on our results, document patterned family and childhood experiences. I mean, we can demonstrate through our senses that these behaviors have a true effect on humanity, a pathological effect, mind you. And we can even create heuristics to monitor them, and labels and taxonomies to categorize the expressions and subgroupings. But how do we concretely pinpoint and define the essence of this affective thing? What truly is the source of this condition, and what is it made of? This is why I approach it as an intangible at its essence, though psychology does as well to some extent. The field also attempts to structure it in a way that makes material claims that present quantifiable and behavioral value, as in the positions of behaviorism, for instance, or neurology. Yet it ends up being useless when there's no intrinsic meaning in the results, or no qualification presented. Again, it renders these studies, that is, they render the condition and humans in general to systems, to programmable and random occurrences or rationally selected figments of nature. This type of data does not help anyone or provide any meaning. Moreover, this is pretty much why I take the position of a spiritual approach and a metaphysical ultimate understanding that can only be properly constructed through a theological presupposition, hence the spiritual component of narcissism. From my worldview, it can be described as a spiritual condition that works in a counterproductive manner when pathological or even subclinical. It seems to create a hyper-focus on the self that is in opposition to the deepest needs of human beings, which is community, family, procreation, and love. God has created us as social beings. Even materialist anthropology demonstrates this. And narcissism, when deformed, is inherently antisocial. And I would argue anti-human, or non-human even. Hence my given value judgment, which of course I do understand is culture bound and contingent on worldview. But by not taking this secular position, I make the claim that there is one truth, an absolute morality, one God, one faith, and a specific meta-narrative that has provided our condition and its ends. So, well, therefore I have the right logically to place my value judgments. Whether you agree, that's based on opinion. Just trying to qualify my reasoning behind claiming narcissism in it of itself is a negative or bad thing. This is, of course, excluding the adaptive or healthy versions of narcissism, of course. Yet we still have not properly even defined narcissism. Our population flirts with the tip of its iceberg. Its theoretical depth and entirety has been spirited away to unknown corners and quarters of academia, keeping it pretty much hidden from the general population. I don't expect society to even consider the academic realm of any real relevance to begin with, but I do believe its relevance is discovered when certain topics or concepts need thorough explanation and demonstration. And many people throw around the word narcissist and have no knowledge of its proper use, or possibly a mere pop psych commercialized concept of it, which for extremely practical uses I guess is okay. I mean, we all are guilty of utilizing complicated terms this way. But when we do it, not only does this misrepresent the true essence or value within the term, but it also confuses the term's user as well as receiver, thereby and ultimately causing a disservice to all participants. It's of great value to know that narcissism is an interpersonal phenomenon. It can only exist as a thing within a given social arrangement. For instance, it is a result and motivator of interactions between people. For instance, a narcissist on an island by himself would have no opportunity to demonstrate his narcissism without a subject to define his narcissism through. It would lose its meaning and therefore fail to exist. Narcissism can only be observed, defined, or analyzed when two or more people are involved, similar to the concept of white and black racial identity. White identity cannot exist in and of itself without its counterpart to give it definition through its difference, which is blackness. Blackness as well cannot exist in and of itself without whiteness to provide it a counterpart to compare itself to. The result or experiences of the comparison and value judgments produced thereafter form the racial identity. They are inherently reactionary and codependent, which defines succinctly the nature of narcissism. Blackness and whiteness is but a silver coin. Both identities' formations are contingent on the influence and presence of the other. What makes me black is what makes you white, and vice versa. If an island had all white people on it, and they never knew or came in contact with so-called black people, they would not have a so-called white identity. They would have no comprehension of the concept of being white. It would simply not exist. It would be impossible to exist. Without each other as dependent counterparts, our identities fail to exist. Our identities are mere results of historical interaction with one another. The identity and existence of narcissism works the same way. Narcissism cannot exist without a counterpart to negate, just as white cannot have meaning without black to differentiate itself. Overall, similar to what sociology would term as racism, narcissism alike is interpersonally based. It is a social issue, an interpersonal impediment or influence. It is qualitatively culturally bound and quantitatively socially bound. Basically, its judgment of being a good or bad thing depends on the culture it is taking place in, and its presence is only possible within a human situation that is inherently social. Here we can understand from a socio- and psycho-spiritual perspective why it is of importance as a subject of study. If you want to understand people or human interaction in general, one cannot even begin to develop that understanding without considering the concept of narcissism. I am basically saying that narcissism is not merely a psychological subject. It is sociological inherently, yet at its base, it is a problem of theological proportions. A disconnect from God, the Holy Spirit, or noumena, results in a schism. A sensory fixation that turns inward and enslaves one's understanding and actions. In result, you get a person without meaning and stability, one that's codependent not merely on others but the manipulation of them, all in a fearful response to an unknown that has been discarded and exchanged for a familiar known, exchanging God for self. A familiar known, also known as a malignant self-love, that is actually a disguised self-hate. A self-hate that could have only been created by way of an interaction with an other. An interpersonal trauma that has resulted in a self-inflicting one. An adaptive behavior that becomes pathological and maladaptive. Self-refuting and insatiable. This is my view of narcissism thus far. As a continuum and enigma, it may not be well understood, but its effect is extremely socially and spiritually influential. Yes, narcissism, as it is described in research literature, is a continuum. I like to break down that continuum or spectrum into three parts. Healthy narcissism, adaptive or subclinical narcissism, and pathological with malignancy at its extreme. This continuum is best described by the studies of Paulus and Williams of 2002 and Wallace and Baumeister of 2002. Though most clinical studies for a concrete scientific structure of narcissism has yet to be produced, its analysis and study as a social and psychological condition has generated demonstrably useful understandings of human experience, family dynamics, society or social relations, and the individual. So we can start with healthy narcissism. I personally do not like this term or categorization because I see it as describing what we would call simple confidence, or what I prefer to posit as rational positive self-regard. It's rational to positively regard oneself within reason. This is protective, productive, and ensures preservation. All things that reassure the existence of human conditions. When experienced in light of truth, morality, and of course God, it is an example of the ideal form of narcissism, if one is to assume such a thing exists. Through a healthy sense of narcissism, we find vast amounts of creativity, balance, vigor, discipline, and zest for life. We all contain this capacity for healthy narcissism. It's human nature, though we all do not express it well, or its capacity has become inverted or exaggerated. And this is when the next level within the spectrum is revealed through adaptive and subclinical narcissism. Yet again, another young artist dies at the hand of pharmakia. Juice WRLD, another typical and factory-like produced image of degeneracy and despair, a perfect example of what postmodern culture provides in an artist: death. Like most artists in this realm, drug abuse, dysfunctional interpersonal relations, depression, and ultimately nihilism is put to drippy melodies of melodic and hypnotizing design, providing nothing more than a message of despair, confusion, and emptiness. A good question could be, why and how has this type of music become so popular? Why are these types of dark and empty messages so accepted? And why is it that all we are seeing in result of this type of music is death and the slow decay of our generations? I will attempt to provide answers to these questions. Let us dig in. Let's first distinguish two categories. One category being that of the entertainment artist, influencer, or celebrity, and the other being that of the general population, or average person, mainly of the millennial and Gen Z groups. I will utilize each of the two categories to paint a picture that demonstrates some reasons why we are seeing and experiencing these socio-cultural dilemmas of today. To start, there are two main concepts that I believe carry much of the weight when it comes to these dilemmas. One being nihilism, but more important and more specific to what we are seeing right now in our culture, is a concept that I would like to share called depersonalization. I believe a great deal of the problems we are seeing today regarding culture have to do with a mass illness and condition of depersonalization. What is depersonalization? And not to be confused with the type that can be conjured by poor sleep quality or bad diet, but the kind that is conjured via trauma, substance abuse, and psychological conditioning. Depersonalization can simply be described as an identity disturbance, distortion of self that produces enduring feelings of detachment or estrangement, causing confusion, anxiety, and depressive disorders. Let's start with the first category, entertainment artist / influencer. Narcissism plays an establishing role in all of this. We're living in a society today that cultivates narcissistic behavior in its culture, not merely through its superficial culture of cosmopolitan consumerism and viral celebrity, but mainly through its technological simulacra, or the social media hall of mirrors, in which no one really knows who they are and exist only to achieve the gaze of the other via screens, and systematically develop their false selves by attempting to get an audience to mirror their behaviors, as if people do not know they are real, until the other signifies their existence through a like. The endless battle to be seen, a structured colony of dancing and relapsing monkeys, artificial people that attempt to act real, and can only understand reality through a lens of memes. Thoughts and culture become minced and juxtaposed strata of memetics. Life becomes irony folded over itself to the point of existential absurdity. Actions and interests are mere mimicry. Self-esteem becomes an aesthetic. An identity is shopped for and purchased like winter sweaters. Subsequently, you will also find identities change with the seasons. Life becomes a dream, a corporate brand campaign with working nostrils, movie-like, and in many cases, completely virtual in digital format. Welcome to the year 2020. Entertainment artists like the late Juice WRLD and all the others only get to the position they are in through this level of lack of self and essential narcissism, the obsessive need to be seen and adored, revered for one's special uniqueness or talent. In other words, the spotlight, as it is so called, tends to be a haven for the narcissistic personality, like a moth to a flame. The pattern of this all is fairly simple. Of course, it all starts with a lack of God and a stable worldview, followed by abuse or trauma, usually in childhood. These children grow up with a hole within them, a void, that is filled by the creation of a false self, which ultimately demonstrates itself through behavioral narcissism and ameliorated through the attention industries, whether that be film, music, and now social media. This is why you'll find that most celebrities and musicians not only come from abusive homes, but they have been sexually abused or severely neglected from a very young age. XXXTentacion is a perfect example of this pattern. The next stage in the pattern comes in the form of addiction. The narcissist is always addicted to something, and all addicts suffer from a form of narcissism, described in putting one's needs of something over all else, regardless of the circumstances. This is why you will find the majority of artists and musicians are heavily addicted to substance abuse and, of course, the accompanying sex addiction. This pattern is prevalent and very easy to spot. Attention, drugs, and sex tend to be the addictions the entertainment artist suffers from most. And it is essentially their lack of God and dis-ease of narcissism that brings them to this point, the point of a nihilistic worldview and a state of depersonalization. Here is where the real dilemma sets in. The entertainers become famous and infect the entire society with their illness through the accumulation of fans and industry media support and promotion. We call this the enabling faction, that which normalizes, justifies, and lionizes mentally ill and spiritually corrupt personalities. From here, this is how culture is ultimately created, through the systematic formulation of these synchronistic processes. As they say, do it for the culture, or do it for the gram. If they only knew what those statements actually meant. But let us continue. So as we can see, mainstream entertainers become entertainers because they have a void within them that exaggerates the need for attention and recognition, a toxic desire and irrational need to be seen. Not merely seen, in fact, but famous or infamous. Their toxic narcissism and comorbid mental illnesses lead them to addictions that usually end up in their early demise. The strangest part is when the general public reveres these types of personalities, and it is usually because they identify with them, because they either suffer from similar illnesses or have been conditioned to through the technological simulacra our generations are trapped within. Their reality has become so distorted and misleading that they no longer make decisions for themselves and have no way of seeing outside of the cultural paradox they have been consumed by. Now let's talk about the general population. Second category. Especially those born after, say, 1996. They're all part of a new breed of human beings. Literally. Their brains are wired completely different due to being raised in an era where technology has replaced many human instincts and behaviors. And no, this is not something called progress, though the establishment will love to fool you into believing so. An important point to address here is that though neoliberal postmodern industries promote demonic and psychologically damaging material as cultural norms, it is the general public and mainly the fans that create what is popular through their consistent support and mirroring. My contention is that they are stuck within a simulacra of social media sorts that has blinded them from reality. In fact, it has caused a fissure, a dissociative reaction that has developed into a mass epidemic of depersonalization. People are no longer genuine people. They are avatars and profiles, handles, and online personalities that do not carry over into the real world. Living a double life is no longer specific to extramarital affairs, but today, it is a sociological norm. In fact, alleged real-world things are established in the digital realm and take precedence over the physical world. Like how relationships today aren't considered relationships unless they are updated so on Facebook or established visually through endless look at us posts on Instagram, stories, and, well, you know the rest. Hereby, the actual physical relationship is ultimately less experienced than the experience of the attentional response given by the virtual audience that exists in the digital abyss. We call them social media communities. The main focus isn't actually living out the relationship in the real world, but instead, the focus is placed on the perception of those watching and reacting in the virtual one. Again, it's like staring into the mirror for attention while completely ignoring the physical person in front of you. The current generations live a virtual existence, detached from the physical one, detached from their own bodies even. Identities are dysfunctional, hence all the gender and identity dysphoria we find so common today. False selves appease the non-existent true self through social media engagement at the expense of real-life engagement and communication. All of this develops narcissistic features and mechanizes human behavior in a way that conditions humanity to behave more machine-like and transactional and less authentic than what God has originally designed. Here we see why these sick individuals like Juice WRLD become famous, because the lot of society are clueless followers who cannot differentiate healthy from unhealthy, good from bad, moral from immoral. They simply devour and consume what is fed to them in large portion. As their loins and flesh assume position, the cycle continues in the form of viral culture. Even the word viral, which refers to virus or disease, perfectly explains the nature of this cycle, perfectly describes how and why it moves the way it does. Indeed, society is sick and diseased, hence the viral culture of today. Another important point of this current generation is the fact that they have been raised in a way that has robbed them of healthy interpersonal development. Most teens and 20-somethings today have developed their capacity for communication and interpersonal relation through screens and not authentic human contact. This dynamic has systematically restructured and rewired the human brain and has resulted in the depersonalized nature of society that we are witnessing today. Growing up in this technopolic society of screens and alter egos and multiple selves, this generation has suffered a dissociated and detached socialization. Mind you, this has never been tested prior, checked for safety or possible future results that may be negative. No, it was thrown on society like a blanket. No questions asked, no limitations drawn. Why do you think so many are insecure, depressed, unable to take simple criticism, and in need of safe spaces and refuge? Why are people today so lost and morally bankrupt that they would even consider death culture, as demonstrated by the likes of Juice WRLD? Because this generation is completely lost and lacks authenticity, truth, and of course, God. Hence their ignorance, sexual obsessions, and drug addictions. Lacking true identity, they latch onto entertainment personas for a semblance of reality, in which I argue is a hyper-reality. See, humans were never designed for this level of asociality, detached, technological existence where screens replace the real world, and postmodern relativism replaces truth and order. Why do you think we are falling apart? Because capitalism? The big bad patriarchy? Don't be silly. Humans are biopsychologically breaking down. The result is mental illness and depersonalization, which leads to addictions, depression, anxiety, psychosis, nihilism, and of course its logical end, suicide. Popularized and worshipped death culture is at hand. Another big problem here is the internet influencers that reciprocate and reproduce the illness. Internet personalities narcissistically exacerbate the problem by reconstituting the artist's messages and culture, by promoting it and making it relevant for their own personal gain. in the form of likes, views, attention, and career. They popularize degenerate mental patients for the sake of nothing more than cultural popularity and vapid virality, all while lining their pockets at the expense of humanity. Now take a generation that predominantly gets its sense of self and human engagement through screens, then add drugs, porn, and autoerotic addictions, all of which rewire the neural pathways, mind you. You will have the result of an entire generation of dissociated, atomized, and narcissistic humanoids. And big tech is only getting bigger, while genuine human interaction and authenticity is only getting smaller. How do you think all of this will play out logically? Think about it. We are so depraved and mentally disfigured that today, strippers, druggies, and prostitutes are the moral agents of sociological influence. But let us not forget that it is a requirement to be mentally ill and spiritually broken to be a stripper, a druggie, or a prostitute. Sex is not work. It is a means to reproduction and a glue that complements marriage. Anything else regarding it has been indoctrinated through the very psychotic and narcissistic culture industry platform that has been the prime discussion of this video. Stable, authentic, and complete humans would never participate in these degenerate realms, let alone even promote them and show open support. Hence the majority of society today that is unstable, narcissistic, spiritually detached from God and their own humanity, i.e., depersonalization. In a postmodern culture where pluralism supersedes logic, bad and good as categories do not exist, and amorality with relativism maintains the role of socio-cultural guidance, all you have left is nihilism, which is ultimately death. The culture of death.